So in this argument, I want to start talking about the concept of validity. And validity is a term when philosophers and other people who talk about deductive arguments talk about validity, we mean it in a specialized way. You can treat it as a bit of jargon. Now, I know that in ordinary talk, people will say, well, that's a valid point, or sometimes even that's a valid argument, just to mean that that's pretty convincing, that's pretty strong. We mean something much more specific by validity. So, look, part of learning any field is to learn the jargon. I'm going to guess whatever your chosen field of study is, you're going to have some jargon that doesn't, you know, that the average person on the street wouldn't understand or would misunderstand. So philosophy is the same way. Some jargon is unavoidable. And some jargon is stupid, right? I mean, sometimes people just throw jargon in to make themselves seem smart. Philosophers are not above that. Oh boy, are we not above that, right? But this is actually a case where I think the jargon is useful because it gets at something that is very, very useful in evaluating deductive arguments. So I think, sometimes we should always be suspicious of jargon, but sometimes it's useful. And I think talking about validity in the sense that philosophers use it, mathematicians will also use this sense of validity, right? So we're not alone here, right? But using it in the sense that philosophers use it is, I think, useful because it picks out an idea that will really help us with deductive arguments. Okay. All of that is to say, if you are sloppy about the way you use validity, the term in this class, I'm probably going to be a bit irked, right? So be careful. Don't go around in your posts saying, oh, this is a little bit valid, or I think this is a fairly valid argument. Be cautious how you use this term. Be careful to use it in the sense that we're interested. All right. Well, anyway, after all that, you're just going to say, well, what in the world does the term actually mean? Well, valid means this. If the premises are true, the conclusion cannot possibly be false. A valid deductive argument, if the premises are in fact true, you cannot even imagine a way that the conclusion could be false. Valid means if you accept the premises, you absolutely have to accept the conclusion. Now, but look, remember I said that when we talk about arguments, it's useful to talk about both the stuff that arguments are built out of, the individual premises, as well as the plan or form of the argument, right? The way those are put together. All validity means is that the argument has a good plan, right? All it means is that the pieces are fit together in a way that will work if the pieces are actually good. But remember, I said, right, our building can have a good plan, and if you build it out of garbage, even with a good plan, it's going to fall down, right? A valid argument has a good plan, but it might not be a good argument. Why? Because, look at our definition. If the premises are true, the conclusion can't possibly be false. None of this says that the premises are actually true, right? A valid argument can have false premises. Remember, whether the premises are true or false, that's what kind of stuff the argument's made out of. Validity is about the plan of it, right? And in the same way that a building with a good plan is going to fall down if you build it out of garbage, a valid argument with false premises is not a good argument. So we'll talk more about this, but I think one useful thing to do with deductive arguments, and the reason we talk about this concept of validity, it's often very useful to ask yourself, well, is the plan even good, right? Is the argument even valid? And if the argument's not valid, and trust me, I know you're going to ask, well, what in the world does a valid argument look like? We'll talk about valid arguments and how to identify valid arguments. But if the argument's not even valid, you don't even have to go through and look at the premises and ask yourself, well, are they true or not? Do I accept them or not, right? So it's kind of a first step. You just say, well, is it valid? And if it's not, then you don't even have to dig into the premises and ask, well, are they true or not? Okay. So anyway, here's two distinctions, or two other bits of jargon that I think are useful. Soundness or sound deductive arguments and cogent deductive arguments. What do I mean by that? Well, a sound argument is one that is valid and has true premises. Premises, not only is the argument valid, you know absolutely the premises are true. In math and geometry, they will always try to go for sound arguments, right? Why? Because math and geometry, it's very clear whether your premises are true or not, right? One of the great things about math, one of the reasons a lot of people love it, right? It's so clear. In philosophy and other areas where we use deductive arguments, it might be a bit messier, right? We might not be able to tell with absolute certainty whether our premises are true or false. And a lot of times, at the very least, though, we want uncontroversial or plausible premises. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that, right? So sound means valid plus true premises. Cogent, at least in the way I'm going to use it, and the way a lot of other people who talk about argument means, well, it's valid, and at the very least, the premises are uncontroversial. Maybe they're not in the sense that we know in math or geometry, they're absolutely true, there's no room for doubt, but at the very least, we're pretty sure these premises are true. So, ideally, we want our deductive arguments to be sound. At the very least, in this class, we want them to be cogent, right? Anyway, so important thing to remember, valid only means if premises are true, conclusion can't be false. Even if an argument's valid, we still have to look at whether the premises are in fact true. A valid argument with obviously false premises is not a good argument. So anyway, let's look at some examples to make this clear. So here is a sound deductive argument. Birds are not mammals, but birds are warm-blooded. So mammals are not the only warm-blooded animals. Birds are warm-blooded, birds are not mammals, so there are some animals that are warm-blooded that are not mammals, right? Birds aren't mammals, that's true. Birds are warm-blooded, that's true. So, and if these are true, if they're not mammals and they are warm-blooded, well, there's at least one sort of thing that isn't a mammal that is warm-blooded. So premise is true, conclusion has to be true as well, and the premises are in fact true. Here is an invalid deductive argument. Some cats are orange. Mr. Whiskers is a cat. So Mr. Whiskers is orange. Now look, I want you to notice, you never met Mr. Whiskers. He was a cat I had when I was way back in grad school. It's actually a roommate's cat. Big, fat, unfriendly cat. Just, yeah. Look, In fact, it's true. Some cats are orange. Mr. Whiskers is a cat. And the conclusion's true. Mr. Whiskers was, in fact, orange. Found out a few years ago Mr. Whiskers is, I guess, in kitty... Well, assume he's in kitty heaven, even though he wasn't the nicest cat, right? But Mr. Whiskers is no longer on this mortal coil. But Mr. Whiskers was orange, right? But look, this isn't valid because you can imagine the premises being true and the conclusion false, right? It could well be the case that some cats are orange and Mr. Whiskers is a cat, but he's not orange, right? All the premises say some cats are orange, Mr. Whiskers is a cat, but for all that, it's perfectly possible that Mr. Whiskers is white or blue or black or any of the other many colors that cats can be, right? These premises could be true and the conclusion false. That's what validity is, right? As it is, the premises are true and the conclusion's true, but it's not valid because you can imagine ways, given what the premises tell us, the conclusion could be false. Some cats might be orange, this might be a cat, but you don't know from that fact that this cat is orange, right? Just from the fact that he's a cat and some cats are orange, that's perfectly compatible with him being lots of other colors, right? Invalid, deductive, because premises could be true and conclusion false. Here is a valid but unsound, also uncogent deductive argument, right? All cats are lizards. Mr. Whiskers is a cat, so Mr. Whiskers is a lizard, right? If these premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true as well, but of course, it is not the case that all cats are lizards, right? No cats are lizards. This is valid, but it has false premises, so it's not a good argument, right? You know, think about others that are silly, right? All triangles have four sides. This is a triangle, so it has four sides. Valid argument. Valid argument, because if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true as well. But it's unsound, uncogent, because it's obviously false, right? By definition, one of the premises, triangles have four sides, is false, right? Same here, by definition, cats aren't lizards, right? So, you can have a valid but unsound, uncogent deductive argument. So, there are really two steps in evaluating deductive arguments. First, figure out if it's valid. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in the next few lectures. This can be a little complicated sometimes. There's some things going on, but figuring out if it's valid in one sense is easy because it's a pretty cut and dried thing. There are valid forms of argument, and once you learn to recognize them, you know if an argument uses those forms, it's valid. There are what we'll call fallacious arguments. And a fallacious argument is, at least one sort of fallacious argument, it's an argument that a lot of people think is valid, that it looks valid, but it's not. And if you see that an argument commits a fallacy, you will know that it is not a valid argument, right? Validity is a very, very cut and dried thing. You can figure out with mathematical precision whether arguments are valid or not. Now, the tricky part One of the reasons that we talk about validity, one of the reasons it's so useful is because it is so precise. It is so cut and dried. It's a science, really, right? The hard part, especially for philosophy, is when you get to looking, once you see that it is valid, you want to ask, well, are the premises true, or at the very least, do we accept them? That's where things get harder. That's where the real debate kicks in. That's where things get to be more of an art than a science. So, but at the very least, we can clear up the bit that is precise, that is scientific, before we jump into 2, which is way murkier, way harder, a bit more unclear, right? Get as much clarity as you can, even if things are not always cut and dried, right?